Dear ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, we are being strongly recommended to start right now, and I think it is indeed time. We have already loosened up the schedule, and I'm now faced as a moderator with the task of this panel. The task is to finish at the latest 35 past midday. So we only have 1 hour for the panel. Therefore, dear panelists, please share this burden of responsibility with me and try to limit your speech to 5 to 7 minutes to start with, so that we can have a second round of Q&A. Let me first introduce myself and introduce my colleagues. I am Dmitry Tulin, Dmitry Vladislavovich Tulin. I work as the first deputy governor for the Bank of Russia. And the panelists are, let me start from over there. First we have Sergei Khotimsky, Sergei Vladimirovich Khotimsky, first deputy chairman at Sovcom Bank. Oleg Vyacheslavovich Vyugin. He's listed today as, let me see, chairman of the management board at the National Association of Security Market. Oleg does a few things, in fact, and has a long track record. In the last 25 years, has managed to be at the top management positions in the state regulator, at the Ministry of Finance, Central Bank, the Federal Service, Federal Agency for Financial Markets. And he continued to be as successful in the private financial institutions, and he now deals one-on-one with the owners of the largest companies in the market. Anatoly Gennadievich Aksakov. Anatoly, I think, is known to everyone in this room, chairman on Committee of Financial Market of the State Duma, as well as chairman of the Council of the Board of Association of Russian Banks. He's been chairing a similar association named slightly differently for a number of years. But of course, Anatoly used to be a hands-on banker for a while in the past as well, so he has first-hand experience in the sphere. Moving on, Daniel Agatovich Akishev, governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan. Mikhail Yuryevich Alexeyev today has the hat of the chairman of the UniCredit Management Board. They are part of a major international banking group. Mikhail has been a regular at the congresses. He is very passionate about the Russian banking industry and banking system, and his experience is also significant, very rich. He's worked at the commercial banks in Russia, in the private sphere, and a few people know that he started actually also as a civil servant, first at the Ministry of Finance of the Soviet Union. And finally, Yuri Olegovich Isayev, Director General at the National Deposit Insurance Agency. The audience is full. The panelists have been introduced. And I would like to first call on Sergei Khotimsky. I'll be frank, if I may, in sharing the story of how he ended up on the panel, how he ended up noticed, he published a paper, an article, rather last autumn in one of the leading business magazines. He has brilliant style, but it was also being very frank, because sometimes we get to be too politically correct and don't call things what they are. Sergei called the hat, or what have you. So he impressed me with that, and therefore I invite him to share his comments, his ideas on the topic of today's panel. You work at the private as it gets, really, type of bank. It's co-owned by a group of individuals, right? And you are part of the direct management of the bank. Yes, okay. So that is correct. And these individuals are not Forbes listed, so they didn't inherit their wealth. So neither did they benefit from the mass privatization of the 1990s. So they are the type of people who are self-made and who've been working, having a lot of first-hand experience in the banking sector. So keeping in mind the first panel of today, the plenary, let me ask you this. The cleanup of the banking sector that has been taking place in the Russian financial field for a while, has it been a positive or a negative trend for you? What are the benefits of it, and what threats do you see in this connection? And what do you wish as a private agent on the market? Thank you so much for this opportunity. I think we've had a very interesting previous discussion, so we are, in a way, already framed to continue with the discussion topics. If I may start with the historic overview, and if you have that history in mind, then you have to realize that this is, of course, a very Russian thing. It's to do with the Russian banking history, despite the international context that we now have to work in. So the uniqueness of the Russian history is due to the two major factors. First is the huge share of one player on the market, something not shared by other large economies. And the second factor is weakness of the banking sector in terms of capital access. This history dates back to the 1990s, when at some stage both regulation and control have been too loose. I think it's been discussed a number of times, but back in the day, the banks could be created at a whim of the owner. They did not have to have the capital. They did not have to have the assets to start with. Soon, inevitably, in the 2000s, we started to realize that the capital had to be there. They had the assets by the time, but not the capital. So from the point on when it became difficult for them to develop without capital, the trend that has been actually worsening for a while now, everyone's realized that they just can't grow without capital. I remember when the first system of deposit insurance was introduced and the first cleanup, you can say, was performed. Back then, it was more formalistic. The essence may not have been there, but over time, the tool set, the kits for banking regulation has been growing, becoming more and more frequently used. And maybe for the period of the past 12 months, we can say that the gap in the banking system didn't grow. 2-3 years ago, it was still growing. Now, we can see that the paradigm has changed. No, we cannot really claim that the capital has become all bona fide. There are still shadow bankers. There are problems and issues at the state-owned banks, because so far it's only the private banks that have been undergoing the cleanup. But everyone has realized, at least, by now that without capital accumulation, further development cannot take place. When we discuss the future of private banks and the horizon for them, then the real capital share as of the private banks have remained roughly the same. They started almost at zero. That is, of course, important to keep in mind because the state banks and the foreign banks had access to capital while private banks hardly had much. But if you look at the joint capital of the banks that have never been criticized by the ranking agencies or the regulator, they have been able to generate capital through revenue, through stakeholders and so on. What we see that these banks they're not losing market share, and they've been having 13 to 17 maybe percent different periods of time. So you can't really say that they've been attacked and they've suffered. No, they've been doing fairly well. I don't want to mention specific examples, but I think it's easy to figure out what group of banks I mean. There are rankings, there's analytics, of course, available. So I don't think it's that their competitiveness of private banks that is an issue. It's is more about separating the real private banks with private money from these quasi-institutions which have sometimes negative capital. So what does the private investor own in this bank if they have negative capital? So this has to be separated. Therefore, the bona fide players, of course, have much more to gain than to lose from the cleanup. We're looking forward, of course, for this period to end. We provide deposit insurance. Yuri, I think, will discuss that. And when the fund has to pay to the specific bank that's been cleaned up, it's not the state that loses that. It's us, our customers. If some bank stole some 30 million rubles and there's a gap in the insurance system, this is what I have to pay because I have 1% stake in share in the insurance agency. So this has to be taken out from the pockets of our customers. It's an unpleasant situation, isn't it? And of course, I've been asked to stick to the short time period, and in order to do that, I think resilience has to be addressed. The role of, at the same time, the role of private banks have been questioned. I don't think there's a genuine opposition between private and the state-owned banks. I think it's about long-term resilience of the system. Regulator perhaps should set the frames. Can a single player on the market have 90% of all the deposits, for instance, or of all the capital? Or is it 70? Or is it 30? If the regulator is ready to accept 90%, then we'll still survive. So even if we have 1% of the market, we will still, I don't know, Herman Gref would have 50 loans and we would have one. That's okay. What I'm saying is that the system cannot be sustainable if it is a one-legged kind of body. State banks have it even worse because when they have to compete with this big player, they face major challenges, bigger than ours. Now we see the bailout come to business. I'm very happy about that. I want to see how the regulator will make these banks attractive and how the regulator will face the problems of competition, but not in theory, but in real life. Make this bank a competitive one and see what kind of problems you're going to face. And when you achieve that, when you've gone through that, I think then the Bank of Russia will have to deal with a number of issues that the private banks have been dealing for a while. Thank you. Thank you, Sergey. I do have more questions for you, but let us first give every panelist a word, and then we'll try to have a second round. Talking to people from the industry, Mikhail Alexeyev, what is your vision? Thank you, Dmitry. I've prepared a brief presentation, and I would really like to stick to the 7 to 8 minutes time frame that you've set for us. So let's start with the slide show. We're now discussing burst traumas and the acquired illnesses of the Russian banking system and the possible healing of it. First of all, Dmitry, I remember you saying about a year and a half ago, when you compared the banking system and banks to HES and the landscape to a large clearing where the bigger ones have already eaten up most of the grass. And I would like to use that metaphor. So this huge bunnies in the Soviet system, there were few. There was enough grass for everyone. Everyone can feed on the grass available. After perestroika, of course, we were having many more animals on the same clearing, and 5 specialized banks were set out. Mr. Dementsev, I remember him very well, worked at the Ministry of Finance, and then he led the State Bank. So he designed the reform to an extent. So we were having more banks, but the system didn't become more efficient. So more private banks have to be added. That was the idea. So they mushroomed in the 90s because there was a lot of new businesses, there was a lot of grass, there wasn't enough for everyone. And globally, what we were seeing, that the investment into the banking sector had very lucrative returns, both in the United States and in Europe, and we had a much bigger return in Russia. So investment allowed many people to end up on the Forbes list, and this used to be very lucrative overall. So frequently, what we saw was 2.5 thousand banks. So here I have the specific number, actually. So now you can, of these hairs on the image, so you can imagine. So in 5 years, we went from a dozen hairs to 2,500. So of course, the biggest burst trauma was the lack of access to capital. The parents gave birth to many babies who couldn't really survive. And that overpopulated the market with unhealthy competitors. There was, of course, at points, low economic growth, the competition was not balanced, there was a big shadow business, and then there were a lot of obstacles for business, and there was a lot of money laundering and related problems. So this is describes the trends from 1990s up to now. The red here is Russia, and the pink is G20 countries. We could have performed better. That, I think, is the main lesson. What we see as happening with the businesses in Russia, what we see is that the number of closed businesses has now become bigger than the number of businesses created. The bankruptcy index is also being creeping upwards. Therefore, the banking system has acquired many more illnesses to do with the lack of risk management capacity or not willing to manage risks when they gave loans to projects of the bank owners. There was, of course, the lack of capital for growth and some really square cheating to do. So it can be comparable to that story of Winnie the Pooh, eating all that was available when he visited his friend. So there is, of course, of non-profitable loans, as you can see, and they were growing, and restructuring of loans that appeared to be healthy but ended up being problematic. This figure is, I think, very telling. We have 100 banks, and about 150 of them have deposited over 20% of their capital at the central banks. It means that they don't have access to customers. There's still a low level of trust to private banks, only 7% trust and 27 don't. As Yuri Detechkin used to say, they steal a lot. That is, of course, a big problem because the black economy, the black market remains what remains in the shadow is still about 1/3 of the economy. And so if you compare that to the famous Soviet movie about the tring grass, where the animals fed on the wrong kind of grass, so they died out at a great rate. So this is how many tombs we have had from the original number of banks. So we went from 2,500 to just 500. Now we have a steady tempo of decrease of the number of banks. This describes the number of licenses revoked. Illegal activities have called for about 40% of revocations, and management systems have been creeping up, as you can see. Now they amount to 60%, more than half. Banking has become less lucrative for investment. They've made about 7 trillion rubles over the recent years, but only 2.6 trillion have been invested back as their capital, so I think is very telling. We don't see new banks being created. Maybe there are some reorganizations, but I really mean very small numbers. It's only a handful. So we continue to see a shrinking of the population. This is the number of international banks, and they have not been feeling very well on the Russian market either. Out of the 500 that remained, let's see what kind of structures exist. As Sergei has mentioned it, other colleagues already. It's not balanced. There's a big dominant here lives on the clearing, and a number of bigger ones, and a number of very small ones. There's not enough grass for everyone. It's what we see is a continued consolidation. 50 biggest banks already have over 80% of the all of the assets. The state-owned segment has been growing. 3 big players have ended up in the consolidation fund, so the state's share have grown even bigger. So this is an emerging trend, and it could be that we end up to a quasi-Soviet system with only few heirs living on the clearing, or just one big one. I'm sure that it will provide for the needs of the banking system, even if we end up in a situation like that. So how do we cure this situation? First and foremost, of course, we need to have grass per se, that is the economic growth. Early diagnostics and through stress tests tells us that there is a healthy sector in the banking system, but there's a lot to be done. Control can be a good factor. Yuri has already described bailout. As they said in the nursery rhyme, when the bunny ended up under the tram, but they just replaced the legs for the bunny, you know, and luckily with banks we can do something similar, but you really have to give them new legs, which can be a challenge. We have to, of course, continue to tackle the shadow banking. We still see licenses being revoked, but of course the central bank has to be rational about it. We need more capital for the banking system. We need better relationship between the players in the banking system, and the consolidation fund will have to give some of the banks that it manages to the private banks, and it's best if we have some kind of a animal-loving manager, such as Det Mazai, not the animal drowning owner as Gerasim, to handle those banks. We've heard from the state-owned banks that they perform very well, but I think the statistics don't support that, apart from perhaps the biggest player. The average return on investment for state banks is much lower than in the private sector. Therefore, private banks are much more cost-effective. But what we see now, unfortunately, is that they tend to support state banks rather than the private ones. My last slide is here, and what we have been seeing is that we first stepped away from the system where most banks were state-owned, and we wanted to make a better private banking system originally, but ended up in a system which is becoming more and more dominated by the state-owned banks, which are not the most efficient, and they don't even meet the benchmark for efficiency that they had in the Soviet period. Therefore, when we see the 3/4 of the banking sector state-owned or operated at the 3/4, as I said, we need to ask the questions about how do we evaluate that efficiency. So far, the access to this clearing has been closed, and it's up to the management only. But I think we need to see whether all the state-owned banks remain healthy. And with that, I would like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Mikhail Yurievich. The audience now understands why we always invite him as a speaker to our congresses. Partially, Mikhail has served as the moderator because he forecasted the next speaker because he introduced him. Yuri, at this panel session, we continue to refer to medical metaphors. It's just the way it is now, but let me ask you to speak not only as a practicing doctor, a practitioner like you were introduced, but like a post-mortem surgeon. You know, the pathology, the post-mortem surgeons usually correct the mistakes, and they basically see what's been done wrong by the previous professionals. Thanks a lot for giving me the floor, for passing the ball on my table, the surgery table. Well, you call me the post-mortem expert. It sounds a little tragic. But we believe that we are not an autopsist. We are a tonoptologist. What we are looking at are the reasons for death, the cause of death, even though those causes are a consequence of a birth trauma or a consequence of, wrong parenting. Nevertheless, all these reasons and causes can be generalized and summarized. And looking at our vast experience, I mean, the banks who left is a much bigger number than the banks who remained. That gives us an indication of the basic problem that the colleagues here talked about. And first and foremost, this is the lack of capital. After investigating the bankruptcy cases of the majority of the banks, and more than a half of all those cases, the capital in those banks was eaten up long before the license was revoked. It might even be the case that this capital was never there. I can't really say that the bankers had acted wrongly starting from the very beginning. Of course, they were hoping to maximize their profits, but they didn't want to give up their, the live money for capital. And if the live money would come, what they would do is they would basically either remove them or replace them with an asset of a different quality. That's the problem number one for a banking sector, and that's the problem that continues to be there. And we just need to recognize it. And by recognizing it, we will make it easier for everyone to live. Problem number 2. That's the problem of the quality of assets available in the bank's balance sheets. Those assets might have been of poor quality right from the outset. But considering the crises we had to live through 2008 and all the rest, the quality of assets has deteriorated. And definitely there were attempts to shut it off from the regulator. And the real cost of assets, when we look at the liquidation cases, but of course these liquidation cases would only showcase the banks that have already gone bust and bankrupt. Well, the cost of their assets only amounts to 15 or 20% of their initial value. So it's a very old problem, dating back to the dog days, starting from the 90s, but with every new crisis, the problem has aggravated. What else? There are some illnesses or diseases we acquired. Some of the assets were basically transported, moved out of the bank, and these are frauds. These are various schemes and plots. But we must mention them because it's becoming an objective reality nowadays. Even if that was not the case, even if the assets were not fraudulently siphoned off the banks, old Chinese stratagem number 8 comes to the mind if you look at the books. So the stratagem number 8 goes the following. Build the wooden bridges as a front and move out to Qinsan. So looking at the stratagem in application to the current reality, the balance sheets, were painted good. The regulator's eyesight was veiled. So if you replace Qinsan into London, well, you'll get what you get. Those wooden bridges as a front, as a koi, were fixed, but actually the army itself moved to London. And there's another stratagem which goes like this: deceive the emperor to sail the sea. Well, that was another idea that our bankers had. They wanted to deceive our regulators and sail the sea, and again end up in London, in the misty Albion. There's another problem, the problem of costs in the banking system. But I believe this problem has not been discussed so vividly in the last years. However, it's becoming more and more acute because cost management leaves much to be desired. Every time we enter a bank, every time we take it over, we see the actual current lease rates, we see the salaries, we see the costs. Well, with such expenditures, dear colleagues, it's very hard to be effective and efficient. So these are the 3 basic challenges we see. There are some other diseases that have developed subsequently. But these diseases were largely outlined before me. Let me just tell you a few words. What has to be done in our hospitals, in our clinics, if we still use medical terms. Rehabilitation units has been removed from our jurisdiction, and that's why it's became a little bit easier. But when it comes to TRES block, or where the newly ill are being brought, those particular departments, every time when we looked at the diagnosis, we were really surprised, because what the diagnosis post-mortem might say is this person has died because of the running nose. But when you cut open the body, you'll see that there were no liver, no kidneys, and no stomach. Today, the diagnosis is becoming much better. So what the post-mortem, what the actual note will say is the root cause of the disease, is the root cause of the death. There's another problem that we've faced not so long ago. It is the speed with which we were getting our corpses for dissection. We wanted those corpses to be still warm on our tables, but when they came to us, they would be almost semi-disintegrated, rotten. And that's the biggest problem, dear colleagues. And this problem was related to the fact that in this particular period of these corpse rotting, there were other interesting stories taking place. I'm not gonna repeat again the news about assets being removed, but the the huge number of bad deals or bad transactions that we had to deal with does cause a concern. So after the death was identified and before the corpse came to us, in between this time, there were lots and lots of bad transactions, and we as a regulator, we must contest those deals. If previously these shady transactions or questionable deals could number in thousands, now they're becoming, well, much less numerous. So the faster the regulator deciding on cleaning up a particular bank, the fewer there will be those questionable deals. What we can also do is continue to pursue the course of interest rates differentiation, because it has already been mentioned that it doesn't seem fair when the scale is too unified, the rate scale. That's why we still have to produce a mechanism by means of which we can get a bigger gap between the rates, a bigger dispersion of rates. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to speak. At that, I would like to finish my intervention. Thank you very much, Yuri, Isaev, Oleg. It's impossible to give people the opportunity to say something specific. All of my panelists are telling the story they want to tell, not the one I'm forcing on them. And that's why I'll give you all the freedom to do what you want. But let me just focus and narrow down your thought on the following. In the recent years, we've been consulting, helping, and assisting a lot to large owners in managing their assets, including the owners of the banking business. And regarding our previous discussions and discussions today, it's been told that the fate of banks rests in the hands of those who manage them. So it rests in the hands of owners and management. Any behavioral aspects you would like to single out, bad and good examples of corporate governance, without actually calling any names? Well, thank you very much, Dmitry, for giving me this floor. It's a very interesting discussion. The only problem I have, we are all moving into the world of death and bodies and corpses. It seems like the banking industry in Russia is already long dead, and now it's being judged for its for its behavior. But I wouldn't paint the picture so black. We've already identified our birth traumas, and it's hard to add anything into that discussion, apart from just giving a number of a couple of special things. And the banking industry is very young. Before 2008, we were accumulating and we were shaping our risk profile. Actually, the risks were accumulating. Actively, because people lacked competence. We hadn't had a core of real good quality captains of industry, bank managers. We were still on the rise, and since the economy was growing fast, we thought that all the risks will pay back. But the next 10 years were not the years of plenty. These were the years when we had to pay for what we've got, because the economy couldn't give anything new to the banks. I can even say that corporate lending has become very toxic and has become very dangerous, because the majority of lenders, they argue this way: we take the loan, but we're going to pay if needs be and if circumstances permit. When the army is being led onto the minefield, it's really hard to ask from them not to be blown up. And for the last 10 years, we've been seeing how our army is being blowing up gradually and how we are paying for our previous debts. The lucky ones are the banks who started business after it, when there were no chances to make any easy money. So if you are doing any banking business now, after the situation, you have to do it properly. And that's the kind of banks that are surviving today, and these are the kind of banks that are benefiting, who stand to benefit from this rapid change in the oversight policy and the overall economic situation. talking about behavior and behavioral patterns, I've already touched upon that topic. The behavior will largely depend on what the owners and bank managers are expecting from you. If they believe in the bright future, and they would, of course, take on and take over lots of risks. And that's not only about Russia, it's actually about every banking system in the world. The 2008 crisis confirmed what Morgan Stanley, chairman of the board, said: when the music plays, everybody dances. So when everybody has optimistic prospects of the future, and you see your neighbor taking risks and making business on it, you start doing the same. It's really hard to stay idle. And this was the kind of behavioral pattern we've seen in the Russian banks, with a very rare exception. Today the situation has changed. The banks have become much more cautious. However, the problems still remain to be quite significant, and our rating agencies confirm this, and people, the insiders, continue to confirm that. I cannot say that we've settled the accounts and everything is okay. A lot remains to be done. The behavior patterns have changed. I know a number of business owners that believe that this banking business has become a burden for them. But you cannot just leave the banking business. You can leave the bank, but you can't leave the banking business. If you're an owner of the bank and you have acquired and you have taken over lots of liabilities, you've invested into assets, how do you exit the business? How do you divest from it? Selling it, impossible. Leaving it, impossible, because you'll be chased and they will knock on your door. But there are some lucky individuals who managed to, by navigating properly, by maneuvering from one business activity to the other business activity, stay afloat. And they are managing to do it faster than their biggest competitor here in the market. And by doing so, they are keeping their risks at bay. It just takes a little bit of business acumen to do it. The last thing I'd like to say, recently we've been talking a lot about capital adequacy. That capital has to be there. Capital does serve as an indicator. If your capital is adequate, it is a health indicator. But looking into the future, it might not even be the most important thing, because new technologies that come along and the banks receive them from external environment, from outside. Banks have to adapt them. So they change the actual business processes and the actual structure of banking businesses. Sberbank, it's not a secret to anyone, is building a proprietary ecosystem. So they add a lot of services on top of the core business. These are the services that will satisfy you, satisfy every your need, again, speaking metaphorically. And if you are in the Sberbank system once, you cannot get out of it. It's a new business model. Well, there comes a question. Capital adequacy here. Does it play a role, and what kind of role does it play? That's why, and Herman Gref has said about that at the previous plenary session, that we have to actually be more cautious about where it moves next. Today, classical control and oversight methods, for banking industry are applicable, but we must still look into the future. Thank you very much. Oleg. When it comes whether, pertaining to your question, whether the capital is an important thing or not, well, banks are still assuming credit risks. While credit risks and loan risks are dominating in the banking industry, you must have capital. Because if banks become scared, will not take any credit risks, will just have operational risks, what they will have as the way of covering them is a very small capital. But then the economy will stop dead, or any other financial monster will come along that Dmitry has been talking about, so capital is still needed. Colleagues, what I'd like to do now is give the floor to our guest, a foreign guest, who is the governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan, Daniyar Akishev. The only thing, I still would like to remind you that we have a little bit, we have a number of time constraints, so if you can please account for that, we'll be very thankful to you for that.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor at this panel. I'd like to thank the Bank of Russia for the invitation. It is of great interest to me and a great pleasure. I'd like to touch upon the comparative analytics of the banking systems of Russia and Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan faces a number of problems of its own. It will be interesting, I think, to compare it with the Russian system and the issues that it faces. I've only been using, of course, publicly available data to analyze the Russian banking system, but I've always been interested in the comparative approach, and as to the banking system itself, as well as in terms of the regulatory system. The Russian experience has allowed us to have a different angle to look at the problems we faced. This gave us a sort of a 3D vision, without necessarily giving us concrete answers, but it helped us to formulate the questions that would help us to move on. So here's a brief comparison that we came up with. And I think there are 4 points in which we seem to do similar things: the institutions, culture, oil, and the role of state. Institutions, I mean, of course, the legal system first and foremost, the management system. And what I will be focusing on is, of course, that each of our countries have a system to protect ownership rights, and this creates the framework for the economic relationship between the bank and the customer. So it's, in a way, very similar, and it also demonstrates the common history. The civic code of both Russia and Kazakhstan are actually very similar. Both countries have a bank dominating their financial systems. This is, I believe, because that, I believe, and loans are the most reliable form of internal funding, and both countries have deposit security agencies and insurance. Kazakhstan has a lower penetration, as you can see, in the banking sector, and we're looking for the source of this problem. We've also been seeing the discussion in the public sphere that this gap should be somehow lessened by stimulating loans. We want to see a positive dynamic in the banking sector, but we want this growth to be of good quality, not just perform well in the statistics. So what we've been through after the crisis, as you can see, was very painful. We had to face a number of issues, one of the biggest share of bad loans worldwide, and we tried to resolve this problem without giving the actual tool to the banks. So they've started to redesign their reporting system rather than their system to resolve the problem with bad assets. This didn't work, and it couldn't have worked, simply because banks didn't have access to working mechanisms to resolve this problem. And only last year we designed a holistic approach to this, a comprehensive approach to this problem. A lot of funding had to be brought to the banking sector to do that. So it's better to have, one horror story than a horror without end. We lived through that, we learned the lesson, and now we move on to tackle the questions of growth and development. Another difference is between our systems is the number of state-controlled banks in Russia and Kazakhstan. We only have one bank like that. It's a specialized Жилстрой Sberbank. The rest are private. The office of Sberbank in Kazakhstan we also consider as private because it has nothing to do with our banks. And this makes Kazakhstan unique because the banking system has been designed and developed from its origin based on the private capital. We restructured 3 banks after 2010 and nationalized them for a short period, but then we resold them successfully. That was always the idea of the regulator that we need not take part in the banking system. The top 5 have a very big share both in Kazakhstan and Russia, but the trends have been different. The concentration has been actually decreasing in Kazakhstan, mainly due to very fast growth in the medium-sized banks. Unfortunately, however, they didn't grow in a very healthy manner because they generated the bad loans that we had to resolve ourselves. So they didn't use the opportunity to grow in a healthy way after the crisis, unfortunately. In terms of loans, what we see, loans to small and medium enterprises, we see that their share is bigger than in Russia. I think that is mostly thanks to the state-operated programs that subsidize the interest rate in order to support the SMEs. I think this stimulates the demand for this product. That's why we perform somewhat better in that area. The share of loans in US dollars compared to liabilities in US dollars. Until 2015, the biggest problem was the number of liabilities in US dollars and the lack of trust to the national currency. In Russia, we've seen a similar trend, perhaps not as acute as in Kazakhstan. This is a share of loans in US dollars for business and the share of deposits in US dollars. Again, historically it's been higher than in Russia, but it's on the downturn right now. This has to do, of course, is connected with the bad loans on the books, and this is, of course, the affiliated credit, one of the problems. There are structural problems as well in the trading sector where the performance rates are not satisfactory. Another observation I'd like to share is that the regulatory mandate has been strengthened over time, and after 2009, when banks attracted a lot of international funding, and then the state had to step in to restructure them using state funding. After that, there's a big quasi-state sector, of course, that have placed their funds in the banks. So for the well-performing banks, this change didn't matter. But for the unscrupulous, it was an opportunity to abuse this funding with up to 70 to 80% of credit given out to affiliated persons. Therefore, we had to bail out last year to a significant amount. To respond, we've been strengthening the regulatory mandate. As I said, now it's legally formulated. Now it's up to the parliament to adopt it. I think our financial sector has now gained the face that we need that, and it has to be done fast. We've also seen the similar problem for the Bank of Russia. But we've also seen positive solution to that through the mechanism of experience judgment, and I think this will have to be followed up in a similar fashion in Kazakhstan. I think the poor understanding of the quality of the assets is a shared problem, and I hope that the financial sector will realize the problems as well, because the state has to pay in the end for this. So this is briefly my comparative observations. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel. And the last, but not least, of course, speaker today, Anatoly Aksakov. You act as a legislator on the one hand, but at the same time, you are, of course, an informer of the legislative on behalf of the banking industry, and you earned my trust for being able to ethically combine these two roles in an unbiased way without really taking a side, but finding a balanced solution that would benefit the society in general rather than a specific group of interest, be that the industry or the regulator. So we look up to you for a word of inspiration. Well, I might take too long. Well, we only have 5 minutes. So we've been discussing the illnesses of the offspring, and now I would like to tackle the issue of the parents, how this offspring came about. The problems came, of course, from the insufficient legislation, because it has to be created fast in difficult situations. But we take our share of the blame. We designed the legislation that was not good enough, and the central bank licensed these banks again in this field. Pavel Medvedev is one of the parents, I think, my teacher at Moscow State University. You were the leader of the banking commission at the Supreme Council of the Russian Federation. Dmitry Tulin, licensed. So both mom and dad are here, one on the panel, another in the audience. And they just gave those dozens and hundreds of licenses, understanding that behind those licenses there was no real capital, in fact, and that the people who applied for license, they were not qualified to actually operate in this area. Dmitry has already mentioned that before I moved to the state legislative, I worked at a bank, at the Chuvash branch of one of the Moscow banks, and I saw that mess happening with my own eyes, of course. I remember how my branch and my head office were seeing huge volume of transactions suddenly. And then I asked the head of the board, chairman of the board, and they said, we are trying to increase the currency balance to show it to our clients that we are much more lucrative than we are, in fact. There was a lack of regulation for that, of course, and poor legislation. So you could do that simpler scheme, sending money from your head office to your branch and back in order to cheat upon your client. And then when you go to the head office and an owner comes and he asks the chief accountant, do you have cash do you have any cash at the cashier? And they just bring him cash and he'll take it, and without any documentation. So that's what I was seeing. Luckily, we're removing most of these problems right now. And when the bank died, the first crisis of 1995, I remember, so I had a call from the head office when they asked the branch for the funds, because the branch was doing well. We were full of liquidity, but we couldn't of course transfer any money because the correspondence accounts were not operational anymore because the head office was almost bankrupt. So I had to transfer that in a suitcase. And then they called for a second such delivery. I realized we were in big danger by the time, so we closed down the branch. We paid off all of our creditors, we paid off the salaries and gave the remaining funds back to the head office. This is how I got my gray hair, actually. And I'm very happy now. I'm very grateful that now the Bank of Russia has started, despite all the pitfalls along the way, to start the cleanup of the banking system. We see the benefits, we see the risks of it, of course. And I'm concerned about those risks, and some of them actually undermine the trust. And the trust is what needed by both parties, not only the players but also the regulator. Let's look at the banking system of the Republic of Venice, where there was no regulator. But the leaders in Venice realized at some point that the regulator might help to set some order. So they picked 3 people as regulator. They started to look around. They saw the number of problems that existed in the banks. So they realized that there have to be more regulators and controllers. So they ended up with having a commissar in every bank, and the banks would disappear very soon. In 10 years, there was 1 bank remaining in the Republic of Venice. So this history lesson tells us how the chain of consequences might lead you somewhere where you didn't intend to go. Therefore, you have to be sensible about regulation and control. One last fact that I've just learned, actually, and I want to use this panel to voice it. One big bank has been. They just told me that now what we see more and more requests for information for the control. So what you see, you have to hire people. You have to redesign their banking products. There are costs that won't really affect resilience. You don't really need to do things. Some administrator, not the top administrator even, wants to know more about how a bank is doing. For instance, how socially relevant organizations they service. Imagine if it was Sberbank, because they service tens of thousands of schools, hospitals, and so on. And then this administrator guy wants this information, so we'll have to process that. So I think this is an example of what may not be done. If you want to request such information, then only the governor or the deputy governor can access that, because you are responsible for the system. When you license that, when BT created the system, together with Pavel Alexeyevich, who were given licenses, so that they will accept these letters from them, but not from anyone else. So what I think in the 2 to 3 years, we will have the system which it was very healthy, not 100% healthy, but almost. Of course, there will be problems, but it will be a healthy, competitive banking system. And I think both Sberbank and VTB and Otkritie, which has now been reorganized, they actually compete in between themselves. They fight over the customer, and they try to find their niches. And I think what we have to do is create an environment where big transnational banks could flourish, regional banks and small banks who work with smaller scale clients. And this is the vision for the future. Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, we're almost on time, but we had to have a later start, and now, unfortunately, I cannot come back to you with additional questions about your pressing needs and visions for how our banking center should look like in 3 to 5 years. First, maybe the perfect, and scenario and then the realistic scenario. Anatoly, of course, I'm responsible for what I was doing in 1980s, early 1990s, last century. I don't think we were parents. I think we were there at the delivery. Yes, but once again, legally, we just have to give them the license because de jure, there had to be a license, but de facto, as soon as you requested one, you just had to give them one. So that was the system. Everybody wanted a baby, and now we have fewer of them. So let's hope we get a productive remainder of the day. Thank you so much.